Sense of Obligation by Harry Harrison, Part 1. It took a very special type of man for the job, and the job was onerous, dangerous, and the only really probable reward was disaster. But when a man who says he knows it's going to kill him asks you to join. A man said to the universe, "Sir, I exist. However," replied the universe, "the fact has not created in me a sense of obligation." Stephen. Crane's sweat covered Brion's body, trickling into the tight loincloth that was the only garment he wore. The light fencing foil in his hand felt as heavy as a bar of lead to his exhausted muscles, worn out by a month of continual exercise. These things were of no importance. The cut on his chest, still dripping blood, the ache of his overstrained eyes, even the soaring arena around him with the thousands of spectators, were triviality. He's not worth thinking about. There was only one thing in his universe, the button-tipped length of shining steel that hovered before him, engaging his own weapon. He felt the quiver and scrape of its life, knew when it moved and moved himself to counteract it. And when he attacked, it was always there to beat him aside, a sudden motion. He reacted, but his blade just met air. His instant of panic was followed by a small, sharp blow. High on his chest. Touch. A world-shaking voice bellowed the word to a million waiting loudspeakers, and the applause of the audience echoed back in a wave of sound. 1 minute, a voice said, and the time buzzer sounded. Brion had carefully conditioned the reflex in himself. A minute is not a very large measure of time, and his body needed every fraction of it. The buzzer's whir triggered his muscles into complete relaxation. Only his heart and lungs worked on at a strong, measured rate. His eyes closed, and he was only distantly aware of his handlers catching him as he fell, carrying him to his bench. While they massaged his limp body and cleansed the wound, all of his attention was turned inward. He was in reverie, sliding along the borders of consciousness. The nagging memory of the previous night loomed up then, and he turned it over and over in his mind, examining it from all sides. It was the very unexpectedness of the event that had been so unusual. The contestants in the 20s needed undisturbed rest, therefore nights in the dormitories were quiet as death. During the first few days, of course, the rule wasn't observed too closely. The men themselves were too keyed up and excited to rest easily. But as soon as the scores begin to mount and eliminations cut into their ranks, there is complete silence. After dark, particularly so on this last night when only 2 of the little cubicles were occupied, the thousands of others standing with dark, empty doors. Angry words had dragged Brion from a deep and exhausted sleep. The words were whispered but clear, 2 voices just outside the thin metal of his door. Someone spoke his name? Brion Brandd. Of course not. Whoever said you could was making a big mistake, and there is going to be trouble. Don't talk like an idiot. This other voice snapped with a harsh urgency, clearly used to command. I'm here because the matter is of utmost importance, and Brandd is the one I must see. Now stand aside. The 20s? I don't give a damn about your games, hearty cheers, and physical exercises. This is important, or I wouldn't be here. The other didn't speak. He was surely one of the officials, and Brion could sense his aged anger. He must have drawn his gun because the other man said quickly, "Put that away. You're being a fool." "Out," was the single snarled word of the response. There was silence then, and still wondering, Brion was once more asleep. 10 seconds. The voice chopped away Brion's memories, and he let awareness seep back into his body. He was unhappily conscious of his total exhaustion. The month of continuous mental and physical combat had taken its toll. It would be hard to stay on his feet, much less summon the strength and skill to fight and win a touch. "How do we stand?" he asked the handler who was kneading his aching muscles. 4. All you need is a touch to win." "That's all he needs, too," Brion grunted, opening his eyes to look at the wiry length of the man at the other end of the long mat. No one who had reached the finals in the 20s could possibly be a weak opponent, but this one, Ihjel, was the pick of the lot. A red-haired mountain of a man with an apparently inexhaustible store of energy. That was really all that counted now. There could be little art in this last and final round of fencing. Just thrust and parry and victory to the stronger. Brion closed his eyes again and knew the moment he had been hoping to avoid had arrived. Every man who entered the 20s had his own training tricks. Brion had a few individual ones that had helped him so far. He was a moderately strong chess player, but he had moved to quick victory in the chess rounds by playing incredibly unorthodox games. This was no accident, but the result of years of work. He had a standing order with off-planet agents for archaic chess books, the older the better. He had memorized thousands of these ancient games, and Pennings, this was allowed. Anything was allowed that didn't involve drugs or machines. Self-hypnosis was an accepted tool. It had taken Brion over 2 years to find a way to tap the sources of hysterical strength. Common as the phenomenon seemed to be in the textbooks, it proved impossible to duplicate. There appeared to be an immediate association with the death trauma, as if the two were inextricably linked into one. Berserkers and Jurima. Ntados continue to fight and kill though carved by scores of mortal wounds. Men with bullets in the heart or brain fight on, though already clinically dead. Death seemed an inescapable part of this kind of strength. But there was another type that could easily be brought about in any deep trance: hypnotic rigidity. The strength that enables someone in a trance to hold his body stiff and unsupported except at 2 points, the head and Ihjel. This is physically impossible when conscious. Working with this as a clue, Brion had developed a self-hypnotic technique that allowed him to tap these reservoirs of unknown strength. The source of second wind, the survival strength that made the difference between life and death. It could also kill. Exhaust the body beyond hope of recovery, particularly when in a weakened condition as his was now. But that wasn't important. Others had died or during the 20s, and death during the last round was in some ways easier than defeat. Breathing deeply, Brion softly spoke the auto-hypnotic phrases that triggered the process. Fatigue fell softly from him, as did all sensations of heat, cold, and pain. He could feel with acute sensitivity here, and see clearly when he opened his eyes. With each passing second, the power drew at the basic reserves of life, draining it from his body. When the buzzer sounded, he pulled his foil from his second startled grasp and ran forward. Ihjel had barely time to grab up his own weapon and parry Brion's first thrust. The force of his rush was so great that the guards on their weapons locked, and their bodies crashed together. Ihjel looked amazed at the sudden fury of the attack, then smiled. He thought it was a last burst of energy. He knew how close they both were to exhaustion. This must be the end for Brion. They disengaged, and Ihjel put up a solid defense. He didn't attempt to attack, just let Brion wear himself out against the firm shield of his defense. Brion saw something close to panic on his opponent's face when the man finally recognized his error. Brion wasn't tiring. If anything, he was pressing the attack. A wave of despair rolled out from Ihjel. Brion sensed it and knew the 5th point was his thrust, and each time the parrying soared a little slower to return, then the powerful twist that thrust it aside, in and under the guard, the slap of the button on flesh and the arc of steel that reached out and ended on Ihjel's chest over his heart. Waves of sound, cheering and screaming, lapped against Brion's private world, but he was only remotely aware of their existence. Ihjel dropped his foil and tried to shake Brion's hand, but his legs suddenly gave way. Brion had an arm around him, holding him up, walking towards the rushing handlers. Then Ihjel was gone, and he waved off his own men, walking slowly by himself. Except something was wrong, and it was like walking through warm glue. Walking on his knees. No, not walking, falling. At last, he was able to let go and fall. Ijhel gave the doctors exactly 1 day before he went to the hospital. Brion wasn't dead, though there had been some doubt about that the night before. Now, a full day later, he was on the mend, and that was all Ijhel wanted to know. He bullied and strong-armed his way to the new winner's room, meeting his first stiff resistance at the door. "You're out of order, Winner Ijhel," the doctor said. "And if you keep on forcing yourself in here, where you are not wanted, rank or no rank, I shall be obliged to break your head." Ijhel had just begun to tell him in some detail just how slim his chances were of accomplishing that, when Brion interrupted them both. He recognized the newcomer's voice from the final night in the barracks. "Let him in, Dr. Calry," he said. "I want to meet a man who thinks there is something more important than the 20s. While the doctor stood undecided, Ijhel moved quickly around him and closed the door in his flushed face. He looked down at the winner in the bed. There was a drip plugged into each one of Brion's arms. His eyes peered from sooty hollows. The eyeballs were a network of red veins. The silent battle he fought against death had left its mark. His square, jutting jaw now seemed all bone, as did his long nose and high cheekbones. They were prominent landmarks rising from the limp grayness of his skin. Only, the erect bristle of his close-cropped hair was unchanged. He had the appearance of having suffered a long and wasting illness. "You look like sin," Ijhel said, "but congratulations on your victory." "You don't look so very good yourself for a winner," Brion snapped back. His exhaustion and sudden peevish anger at this man let the insulting words slip out. Ijhel ignored them. But it was true. Winner Ijhel looked very little like a inner or even an Anvharian. He had the height and the frame all right, but it was draped in billows of fat. Rounded, soft tissue that hung loosely from his limbs and made little limp rolls on his neck and under his eyes. There were no fat men on Anvhar, and it was incredible that a man so gross could ever have been a winner. If there was muscle under the fat, it couldn't be seen. Only his eyes appeared to still hold the strength that had once ested every man on the planet to win the annual games. Brion turned away from their burning stare, sorry now he had insulted the man without good reason. He was too sick, though, to bother about apologizing. Ijhel didn't care either. Brion looked at him again and felt the impression of things so important that himself, his insults, even the 20s were of no more interest than dust motes in the air. It was only a fantasy of sick mind, Brion knew, and he tried to shake the feeling off. The two men stared at each other, sharing a common emotion. The door opened soundlessly behind Ijhel, and he wheeled about, moving as only an athlete of Anvhar can move. Dr. Kalri was halfway through the door, off balance. Two more men in uniform came close behind him. Ijhel's body pushed against them, his speed and the mountainous mass of his flesh sending them back in a tangle of arms and legs. He slammed the door and locked it in their faces. "I have to talk to you," he said, turning back to Brion. "Privately," he added, bending over and ripping out the communicator with a sweep of one hand. "Get out," Brion told him. "If I were able." "Well, you're not, so you're just going to have to lie there and listen. I imagine we have about 5 minutes before they decide to break the door down. I don't want to waste any more of that. Will you come with me off-world? There's a job that must be done. It's my job, but I'm going to need help. You're the only one who can give me that help." "Now refuse," he added as Brion started to answer. "Of course I refuse," Brion said, feeling a little foolish and slightly angry, as if the other man had put the words into his mouth. "Anvhar is my planet. Why should I leave my lie? Is here, and so is my work. I also might add that I have just won the 20s. I have a responsibility to remain." "Nonsense. I'm a winner and I left. What you really mean is you would like to enjoy a little of the ego inflation you have worked so hard to get. Off Anvhar no one even knows what a winner is, much less respects one. You have to face a big universe out there, and I don't blame you for being a little frightened." Someone was hammering loudly on the door. "I haven't the strength to get angry," Brion said hoarsely. "And I can't bring myself to admire your ideas when they permit you to insult a man too ill to defend himself." "I apologize," Ijhel said, with no hint of apology or sympathy in his voice. "But there are more desperate issues involved other than your hurt feelings. We don't have much time now, so I want to impress you with an idea that will convince me to go off-planet with you. That's expecting a lot. No, this idea won't convince you, but thinking about it will. If you really consider it, you will find a lot of your illusions shattered. Like everyone else on Anvhar, you're a scientific humanist with your faith firmly planted in the 20s. You accept both of those noble institutions without an instant's thought. All of you haven't a single thought. For the past, for the untold billions who led the bad life as mankind slowly built up the good life for you to lead. You ever think of all the people who suffered and died in misery and superstition, while civilization was clicking forward one more slow notch? Of course I don't think about them, Brion snapped back. Why should I? I can't change the past. But you can change the future, Ijhel said. You owe something to the suffering ancestors who got you where you are today. If scientific humanism means anything more than plain words to you, you must possess a sense of responsibility. Don't you want to try and pay off a bit of this debt by helping others who are just as backward and disease-ridden today as great-grandfather Troglodyte ever was? The hammering on the door was louder. This and the drug-induced buzzing in Brion's ears made thinking difficult. "Abstractedly, I, of course, agree with you," he said haltingly. "But you know there is nothing I can do personally without being emotionally involved. A logical decision is valueless for action without personal meaning." "Then we have reached the crux of the matter," Ijhel said gently. His back was braced against the door, absorbing the thudding blows of some heavy object on the outside. "They're knocking, so I must be going soon. I have no time for details, but I can assure you upon my word of honor as a winner that there is something you can do. Only you. If you help me, we might save 7 million human lives. That is a fact." The lock burst and the door started to open. Ijhel shouldered it back into the frame for a final instant. "Here is the idea I want you to consider. Why is it that the people of Anvhar in a galaxy filled with warring, it-filled, backward planets should be the only ones who base their entire existence on a complicated series of games?" This time there was no way to hold the door. Ijhel didn't try. He stepped aside and 2 men stumbled into the room. He walked out behind their backs without saying a word. "What happened? What did he do?" the doctor asked, rushing in through the ruined door. He swept a glance over the continuous recording dial. Was at the foot of Brion's bed. Respiration, temperature, heart, blood pressure, all were normal. The patient lay quietly and didn't answer him. For the rest of that day, Brion had much to think about. It was difficult. The fatigue, mixed with the tranquilizers and other drugs, had softened his contact with reality. His thoughts kept echoing back and forth in his mind, unable to escape. What had Ijhel meant? What was that nonsense about Anvhar? Anvhar was that way because, well, it just was. It had come about naturally, or had it? The planet had a very simple history. From the very beginning, there had never been anything of real commercial interest on Anvhar. Well off the interstellar trade routes, there were no minerals worth digging and transporting the immense distances to the nearest inhabited worlds. Hunting the winter beasts for their pelts was a profitable but very minor enterprise, never sufficient for mass markets. Therefore, no organized attempt had ever been made to colonize the planet. In the end, it had been settled completely by chance. A number of off-planet scientific groups had established observation and research stations, finding unlimited data to observe and record during Anvhar's unusual yearly cycle. The long-duration observations encouraged the scientific workers to bring their family. And slowly but steadily, small settlements grew up. Many of the fur hunters settled there as well, adding to the small population. This had been the beginning. Few records existed of those early days, and the first 6 centuries of Anvharian history were more speculation than fact. The breakdown occurred about that time, and in the galaxy-wide disruption, Anvhar had to fight its own internal battle. When the Earth Empire collapsed, it was the end of more than an era. Many of the observation stations found themselves representing institutions that no longer existed. The professional hunters no longer had markets for their furs, since Anvhar possessed no interstellar ships of its own. There had been no real physical hardship involved in the breakdown, as it affected Anvhar, since the planet was completely self-sufficient. Once they had made the mental adjustment to the fact that they were now a sovereign world, not a collection of casual visitors with various loyalties. Life continued unchanged. Not easy. Living on Anvhar is never easy, but at least without difference on the surface. The thoughts and attitudes of the people were, however, going through a great transformation. Many attempts were made to develop some form of stable society and social relationship. Again, little record exists of these early trials other than the fact of their culmination in the 20s. Fencing to understand the 20s, you have to understand the unusual orbit that Anvhar tracks around its sun, 70 off Ihjel. There are other planets in this system, all of them more or less conforming to the plane of the ecliptic. Anvhar is obviously a rogue, perhaps a captured planet of another sun. For the greatest part of its 780-day year, it arcs far out from its primary, in a high-angled, sweeping cometary orbit. When it returns, there is a brief, hot summer of approximately 80 days before the long winter sets in once more. This severe difference in seasonal change has caused profound adaptations in the native life forms. During the winter, most of the animals hibernate, the vegetable life lying dormant as spores or seeds. Some of the warm-blooded herbivores stay active in a snow-covered tropics preyed upon by fur-insulated carnivores. Though unbelievably cold, the winter is a season of peace in comparison to the summer. This is a time of mad growth. Plants burst into life with a strength that cracks rocks, growing fast enough for the motion to be seen. The snow fields melt into mud, and within days, a jungle stretches high into the air. Everything grows, swells, proliferates. Plants climb on top of plants, fighting for the life energy of the sun. Everything is eat and be eaten, grow and thrive in the short season. Because when the first snow of winter falls again, 90% of the year must pass until the next coming of warmth. Mankind has had to adapt to the Averian cycle in order to stay alive. Food must be gathered and stored, enough to last out the long winter. Generation after generation had adapted until they look on the mad seasonal imbalance as something quite ordinary. The first thaw of almost non-existent spring triggers a wide-reaching metabolic change in the humans. Layers of subcutaneous fat vanish and half-dormant sweat glands come to life. Other changes are more subtle than the temperature adjustment, but equally important. The sleep center of the brain is depressed. Short naps or a night's rest every third or fourth day become in. Life takes on a hectic and hysterical quality that is perfectly suited to the environment. By the time of the first frost, rapid growing crops have been raised and harvested, sides of meat either preserved or frozen in mammoth lockers. With his supreme talent of adaptability, mankind has become part of the ecology and guaranteed his own survival during the long winter. Physical survival has been guaranteed. But what about men? Till survival? Primitive Earth Eskimos can fall into a long doze of half-conscious hibernation. Civilized men might be able to do this, but only for the few cold months of terrestrial midwinter. It would be impossible to do during a winter that is longer than an Earth year. With all the physical needs taken care of, boredom became the enemy of any Averian who was not a hunter. And even the hunters could not stay out on solitary trek all winter. Drink was one answer and violence another. Alcoholism and murder were the twin terrors of the cold season after the breakdown. It was the 20s that ended all that. When they became a part of normal life, the summer was considered just an interlude between games. The 20s were more than just a contest. They became a way of life that satisfied all the physical, competitive, and intellectual needs of this unusual planet. They were a decathlon, rather a doubled decathlon, raised to its highest power, where contests in chess and poetry composition held equal place with those in ski jumping and archery. Each year there were 2 planet-wide contests held, one for men and one for women. This was not an attempt at sexual discrimination, but a logical facing of facts. Inherent differences prevented fair contests. For example, it is impossible for a woman to win a large chess tournament, and this fact was recognized. Anyone could enter for any number of years. There were no scoring handicaps. When the best man won, he was really the best man. A complicated series of playoffs and eliminations kept contestants and observers busy for half the winter. They were only preliminary to the final encounter that lasted a month and picked a single winner. That was the idol he was awarded. Winner, the man and woman who had bested every other contestant on the entire planet and who would remain unchallenged until the following year. Winner. It was a title to take pride in. Brion stirred weakly on his bed and managed to turn so he could look out of the window. Winner of Anvar. His name was already slated for the history books, one of the handful of planetary heroes. School children would be studying him now, just as he had read of the winners of the past, weaving daydreams and imaginary adventures around Brion's victories, hoping and fighting so someday equal them. To be a winner was the greatest honor in the universe. Outside, the afternoon sun shimmered weakly in a dark sky. The endless ice fields soaked up the dim light, reflecting it back as a colder and harsher illumination. A single figure on skis cut a line across the empty plain. Nothing else moved. The depression of the ultimate fatigue fell on Brion, and everything changed, as if he looked in a mirror at a previously hidden side. He saw suddenly, with terrible clarity, that to be a winner was to be absolutely nothing. Like being the best flea among all the fleas on a single dog. What was Anvar after all? an ice-locked planet inhabited by a few million human fleas, unknown and unconsidered by the rest of the galaxy. There was nothing here worth fighting for. The wars after the breakdown had left them untouched. The Anvharian had always taken pride in this, as if being so unimportant that no one else even wanted to come near you could possibly be a source of pride. All the worlds of man grew, fought, won, lost, changed. Only on Anvhar did life repeat its sameness endlessly like a loop of tape in a player. Brion's eyes were moist. He blinked. Tears. Realization of this incredible fact wiped the maudlin pity from his mind and replaced it with fear. Had his mind snapped in the strain of the last match? These thoughts weren't his. Self-pity hadn't made him a winner. Why was he feeling it now? Anvhar was his universe. How could he even imagine it as a tag-end planet at the outer limb of creation? What had come over him and induced this inverse King? As he thought the question, the answer appeared at the same instant. Winner Ijhel, the fat man with the strange pronouncements and probing questions. Had he cast a spell like some sorcerer or the devil in Faust? No, that was pure nonsense, but he had done something. Perhaps planted a suggestion when Brion's resistance was low, or used subliminal vocalization like the villain in Cerebrus Chained. Brion could find no adequate reason on which to base his suspicions, but he knew that Ihjel was responsible. He whistled at the sound switch next to his pillow, and the repaired communicator came to life. The duty nurse appeared in the small screen. "The man who was here today," Brion said. "Winner Ihjel, do you know where he is? I must contact him." For some reason, this flustered her professional calm. The nurse started to answer, excused herself, and blanked the screen. When it lit again, a man in guard's uniform had taken her place. "You made an inquiry," the guard said, "about Winner Ihjel. We are holding him here in the hospital following the disgraceful way in which he broke into your room." "I have no charges to make. Will you ask him to come and see me at once?" The guard controlled his shock. "I'm sorry, Winner. I don't see how we can. Dr. Colry left specific orders that you were not to be." "The doctor has no control over my personal life," Brion snapped at him. "I'm not infectious or ill with anything more than extreme fatigue. I want to see that man. At once." The guard took a deep breath and made a quick decision. "He is on the way up now," he said and rung off. "What did you do to me?" Brion asked as soon as Ihjel had entered and they were alone. "You won't deny that. You have put alien thoughts in my head." "No, I won't deny it, because the whole point of my being here is to get those alien thoughts across to you." "Tell me how you did it," Brion insisted. "I must know." "I'll tell you, but there are many things you should understand first before you decide to leave Anvhar. You must not only hear them, you will have to believe them. The primary thing, the clue to the rest, is the true nature of your life here. How do you think the Twenties originated?" Brion carefully took a double dose of the mild stimulant he was allowed before he answered. "I don't think," he said. "I know. It's a matter of historical record. The founder of the games was Giroldi. The first contest was held in 378 AB. The Twenties have been held every year since then. They were strictly local affairs in the beginning, but were soon established on a planet-wide scale." "True enough," Ijhel said, "but you're describing what happened. I asked you how the Twenties originated. How could any single man take a barbarian planet, lightly inhabited by half-mad hunters and alcoholic farmers, and turn it into a smooth-running social machine built around the artificial structure of the Twenties? It just can't be done." "But it was done," Brion insisted. "You can't deny that, and there is nothing artificial about the Twenties. They are a logical way to live a life on a planet like this." Ihjel had to laugh, a short, ironic bark. "Very logical," he said, "but how often does logic have anything to do with the organization of social groups and governments? You're not thinking. Put yourself in Founder Giroldi's place. Imagine that you have glimpsed the great idea of the Twenties and you want to convince others. So you walk up to the nearest louse-ridden, brawling, superstitious, booze-embalmed hunter and explain clearly how a program of his favorite sports, things like poetry, archery, and chess, can make his life that much more interesting and virtuous. You do that, but keep your eyes open and be ready for a fast draw. Even Brion had to smile at the absurdity of the suggestion. Of course, it couldn't happen that way. Yet, since it had happened, there must be a simple explanation. "We can beat this back and forth all day," Ihjel told him, "and you won't get the right idea unless—" He broke off suddenly, staring at the communicator. The operation light had come on, though the screen stayed dark. Ijhel reached down a meaty hand and pulled loose the recently connected wires. That doctor of yours is very curious, and he's going to stay that way. The truth behind the 20s is none of his business, but it's going to be yours. You must come to realize that the life you lead here is a complete and artificial construction, developed by societics experts and put into application by skilled field workers. Nonsense, Brion broke in. Systems of society can't be dreamed up and forced on people like that, not without bloodshed and violence. Nonsense, yourself, Ijhel. Old him. That may have been true in the dawn of history, but not anymore. You have been reading too many of the old Earth classics. You imagine that we still live in the ages of superstition. Just because fascism and communism were once forced on reluctant populations, you think this holds true for all time. Go back to your books. In exactly the same era, democracy and self-government were adapted by former colonial states like India and the Union of North Africa, and the only violence was between local religious groups. Change is the lifeblood of mankind. Everything we today accept as normal was at one time an innovation, and one of the most recent innovations is the attempt to guide the societies of mankind into something more consistent with the personal happiness of individuals. The God complex, Brion said, forcing human lives into a mold whether they want to be fitted into it or not. Societics can be that, Ijhel agreed. It was in the beginning, and there were some disastrous results of attempts to force populations into a political climate where they didn't belong. They weren't all failures. Anvar here is a striking example of how good the technique can be when correctly applied. It's not done this way anymore, though. Like all of the other sciences, we have found out that the more we know, the more there is to know. We no longer attempt to guide cultures towards what we consider a beneficial goal. There are too many goals, and from our limited vantage point, it is hard to tell the good ones from the bad ones. All we do now is try to protect the growing cultures, give a little jolt to the stagnating ones, and bury the dead ones. When the work was first done here on Anvar, a theory hadn't progressed that far. The understandably complex equations that determine just where in the scale from a type I to a type V a culture is had not yet been completed. The technique then was to work out an artificial culture that would be most beneficial for a planet, then bend it into the mold. But how? Brion asked. We've made some progress. You're finally asking how. The technique here took a good number of agents and a great deal of money. Personal honor was emphasized in order to encourage dueling. This led to a heightened interest in the technique of personal combat. When this was well entrenched, Giroldi was brought in, and he showed how organized competitions could be more interesting than haphazard encounters. Tying the intellectual aspects onto the framework of competitive sports was a little more difficult, but not overwhelmingly. Oh, the details aren't important. All we are considering now is the end product. Which is you. You're needed very much. Why me? Brion asked. Why am I special? Because I won the 20s? I can't believe that. Taken objectively, there isn't that much difference between myself and the 10 runners-up. Why don't you ask one of them? They could do your job as well as I. No, they couldn't. I'll tell you later why you are the only man I can use. Our time is running out, and I must convince you of some other things first. Ijhel glanced at his watch. We have less than 3 hours to deadline. Before that time, I must explain enough of our work to you to enable you to decide voluntarily to join us. A very tall order, Brion said. You might begin by telling me just who this mysterious we is that you keep referring to. The cultural relationships. Foundation. A non-governmental body, privately endowed, existing to promote peace and ensure the sovereign welfare of independent planets, so that all will prosper from the goodwill and commerce thereby engendered. Sounds like you're quoting, Brion told him. No one could possibly make up something that sounds like that on the spur of the moment. I was quoting from our Charter of Organization, which is all very fine. In a sense, but I'm talking specifically now. About you. You are the product of a tightly knit and very advanced society. Your individuality has been encouraged by your growing up in a society so small in population that only a mild form of government control is necessary. The normal Anvarian education is an excellent one, and participation in the 20s has given you a general and advanced education second to none in the galaxy. It would be a complete waste of your entire life if you now took all this training and wasted it on some rustic farm. You give me very little credit. I plan to teach. Forget Anvar? Ijhel cut him off with a chop of his hand. This world will roll on quite successfully whether you are here or not. You must forget it. Think of its relative unimportance on a galactic scale and consider instead the exists. Suffering hordes of mankind. You must think what you can do to help them. But what can I do as an individual? The day is long past when a single man like Caesar or Alexander could bring about world-shaking changes. True, but not true, Ijhel said. There are key men in every conflict of forces, men who act like catalysts applied at the right instant to start a chemical reaction. You might be one of those, but I must be honest and say that I can't prove it yet. So in order to save time and endless discussion, I think I will have to spark your personal sense of obligation. Obligation to whom? To mankind, of course, to the countless billions of dead who kept the whole machine rolling along that allows you the full, long, and happy life you enjoy today. What they gave to you, you must pass on to others. This is the keystone of humanistic morals. Agreed, and a very good argument in the long run, but not one that is going to tempt me out of this bed within the next 3 hours. A point of success, Ijhel said. You agree with the general argument. Now I apply it specifically to you. Here is the statement I intend to prove. There exists a planet with a population of 7 million people. Unless I can prevent it, this planet will be completely destroyed. It is my job to stop that destruction, so that is where I am going now. I won't be able to do the job alone. In addition to others, I need you. Not anyone like you, but you and you alone. You have precious little time left to convince me of all that, Brion told him. So let me make the job easier for you. The work you do, this planet, the imminent danger of the people there, these are all facts that you can undoubtedly supply. I'll take a chance that this whole thing is not a colossal bluff and admit that given time, you could verify them all. This brings the argument back to me again. How can you possibly prove that I am the only person in the galaxy who can help you? I can prove it by your singular ability, the thing I came here to find. What ability? I am different in no way from the other men on my planet. You're wrong, Ijhel said. You are the embodied proof of evolution. Rare individuals with specific talents occur constantly in any species, man included. It has been 2 generations since an empathetic was last born on Anvar, and I have been watching carefully most of that time. What in blazes is an empathetic, and how do you recognize it when you have found it? Brion chuckled. This talk was getting preposterous. I can recognize one because I'm one myself. There is no other way. As to how projective empathy works, you had a demonstration of that a little earlier when you felt those strange thoughts about Anvar. It will be a long time before you can master that, but receptive empathy is your natural trait. This is mentally entering into the feeling, or what could be called the spirit of another person. Empathy is not thought perception. It might better be described as the sensing of someone else's emotional makeup, feelings, and attitudes. You can't lie to a trained empathetic because he can sense the real attitude behind the verbal lies. Even your undeveloped talent has proved immensely useful in the 20s. You can outguess your opponent because you know his movements even as his body tenses to make them. You accept this without ever questioning it. How do you know? This was Brion's understood, but never voiced secret. Ijhel smiled. Just guessing. But I won the 20s too, remember, also without knowing a thing about empathy at the time. On top of our normal training, it's a wonderful trait to have. Which brings me to the proof we mentioned a minute ago. When you said you would be convinced if I could prove you were the only person who could help me. I believe you are, and that is one thing I cannot lie about. It's possible to lie about a belief verbally, to have a falsely based belief, or to change a belief. But you can't lie about it to yourself. Equally important, you can't lie about a belief to an empathetic. Would you like to see how I feel about this? See is a bad word. There is no vocabulary for this kind of thing yet. Better, would you join me in my feelings, sense my attitudes, memories, and emotions just as I do? Brion tried a protest, but he was too late. The doors of his senses were pushed wide and he was overwhelmed. Dis, Ijhel said aloud. 7 million people, hydrogen bombs, Brion Brandd. These were just key words, landmarks of association. With each one, Brion felt the rushing wave of the other man's emotions. There could be no lies here. Ijhel was right in that. This was the raw stuff that feelings are made of, the basic reactions to the things and symbols of memory. Dis. 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 It was a word, it was a planet, and the word thundered like a drum, the sound of its thunder surrounded, and was a wasteland, a planet of death, a planet where living was dying and dying, was very better than living, crude, barbaric, backward, miserable, dirty. Beneath consideration planet, dis hot, burning, scorching wasteland of sands and sands and sands and sands that burned Burned will burn forever the people of this planet, so crude, dirty, miserable, barbaric, subhuman, inhuman, less than human. But they were going to be dead. And dead, they would be 7 million blackened corpses that would blacken your dreams, all dreams, dreams forever, because those hydrogenbombs were waiting to kill them unless, you Ijhel stopped at you Ijhel, death. You death. You death, alone couldn't do it, you death. Must have Brion Brandd wet behind the ears, raw and trained Brion Brandd to help you. He was the only one in the galaxy who could finish the job. As the flow of sensation died away, Brion realized he was sprawled back weakly on his pillows, soaked with sweat, washed with the memory of the raw emotion. Across from him, Ijhel sat with his face bowed into his hands. When he lifted his head, Brion saw within his eyes a shadow of the blackness he had just experienced. Death, Brion said. That terrible feeling of death. It wasn't just the people of Dis who would die. It was something more personal. Myself, Ijhel said, and behind this simple word were the repeated echoes of night that Brion had been made aware of with his newly recognized ability. My own death, not too far away. This is the wonderfully terrible price you must pay for your talent. Angst is an inescapable part of empathy. It is a part of the whole unknown field of psi-phenomena that seems to be independent of time. Death is so traumatic and final that it reverberates back along the timeline. The closer I get, the more aware of it I am. There is no exact feeling of date, just a rough location in time. That is the horror of it. I know I will die soon after I get to Dis, and long be. For the work there is finished. I know the job to be done there, and I know the men who have already failed at it. I also know you are the only person who can possibly complete the work I have started. Do you agree now? Will you come with me? Yes, of course, Brion said. I'll go with you. I've never seen anyone quite as angry as that doctor, Brion said. Can't blame him. Ijhel shifted his immense weight and grunted from the console, where he was having a coded conversation with the ship's brain. He hit the keys quickly and read the answer from the screen. You took away his medical moment of glory. How many times in his life will he have a chance to nurse back to rugged, smiling health the triumphantly exhausted winner of the 20s? Not many, I imagine. The wonder of it is how you managed to convince him that you and the ship here could take care of me as well as his hospital. I could never convince him of that, Ijhel said, but I and the Cultural Relationships Foundation have some powerful friends on Anvar. I'm forced to admit I brought a little pressure to bear. He leaned back and read the course tape as it streamed out of the printer. We have a little time to spare, but I would rather spend it waiting at the other end. We'll blast as soon as I have you tied down in a stasis field. The completeness of the stasis field leaves no impression on the body or mind. In it, there is no weight, no pressure, no pain, no sensation of any kind. Except for a stasis of very long duration, there is no sensation of time. To Brion's consciousness, Ijhel flipped the switch off with a continuation of the same motion that had turned it on. The ship was unchanged. Only outside of the port was the red-shot blankness of jump spa. Ace, how do you feel? Ijhel asked. Apparently the ship was wondering the same thing. Its detector unit, hovering impatiently just outside of Brion's stasis field, darted down and settled on his forearm. The doctor back on Anvar had given the medical section of the ship's brain a complete briefing. A quick check of a dozen factors of Brion's metabolism was compared to the expected norm. Apparently everything was going well, because the only reaction was the expected injection of vitamins and glucose. Can't say I'm feeling wonderful yet, Brion answered, levering himself higher on the pillows. But every day it's a bit better, steady progress. I hope so, because we have about 2 weeks before we get to Dis. Think you'll be back in shape by that time? No promises, Brion said, giving a tentative squeeze to one bicep. It should be enough time, though. Tomorrow I start mild exercise, and that will tighten me up again. Now, tell me more about Dis and what you have to do there. I'm not going to do it twice, so just save your curiosity a while. We're heading for a rendezvous point now to pick up another operator. This is going to be a 3-man team, you, me, and an exobiologist. As soon as he is aboard, I'll do a complete briefing for you both at the same time. What you can do now is get your head into the language box and start working on your Disan. You'll want to speak it perfectly by the time we touch down. With an auto-hypno for complete recall, Brion had no difficulty in mastering the grammar and vocabulary of Disan. Pronunciation was a different matter altogether. Almost all the word endings were swallowed, muffled, or gargled. The language was rich in glottal stops, cl, ix, and guttural strangling sounds. Ijhel stayed in a different part of the ship when Brion used the voice mirror and analysis scope, claiming that the awful noises interfered with his digestion. Their ship angled through jump space along its calculated course. It kept its fragile human cargo warm, fed them, and supplied breathable air. It had orders to worry about Brion's health, so it did, checking constantly against its recall. It instructions and noting his steady progress. Another part of the ship's brain counted microseconds with moronic fixation, finally closing a relay when a predetermined number had expired in its heart. A light flashed, and a buzzer hummed gently but insistently. Ihjel yawned, put away the report he had been reading, and started for the control room. He shuddered when he passed the room where Brion was listening to a playback of his Isan efforts. "Turn off that dying brontosaurus and get strapped in," he called through the thin door. "We're coming to the point of optimum possibility, and we'll be dropping back into normal space soon." The human mind can ponder the incredible distances between the stars, but cannot possibly contain within itself a real understanding of them. Marked out on a man's hand, an inch is a large unit of measure. In interstellar space, a cubical area with sides 100,000 miles long is a microscopically fine division. Light crosses this distance in a fraction of a second. To a ship moving with a relative speed far greater than that of light, this measuring unit is even smaller. Theoretically, it appears impossible to find a particular area of this size. Technologically, it was a repeatable miracle that occurred too often to even be interesting. Brion and Ihjel were strapped in when the jump drive cut off abruptly, lurching them back into normal space and time. They didn't unstrap, just sat and looked at the dimly distant pattern of stars. A single sun, of apparent 5th magnitude, was their only neighbor in this lost corner of the universe. They waited while the computer took enough star sights to triangulate a position in 3 dimensions, muttering to itself electronically while it did the countless calculations to find their position. A warning bell chimed, and the drive cut on and off so quickly the 2 acts seemed simultaneous. This happened again, twice, before the brain was satisfied it had made as good a fix as possible and flashed a navigation power OFF light. Ihjel unstrapped, stretched, and made them a meal. Ihjel had computed their passage time with criminally precise allowances. Less than 10 hours. After they arrived, a powerful signal blasted into their waiting receiver. They strapped in again as the navigation power on signal blinked insistently. A ship had paused in flight somewhere relatively near in the vast volume of space. It had entered normal space just long enough to emit a signal of radio query on an assigned wavelength. Ihjel's ship had detected this and instantly responded with a verifying signal. The passenger Spay Sir had accepted this assurance and gracefully laid a 10-foot metal egg in space. As soon as this had cleared its jump field, the parent ship vanished towards its destination, light years away. Ihjel's ship climbed up the signal it had received. This signal had been recorded and examined minutely. Angle, strength, and Doppler movement were computed to find course and distance. A few minutes of flight were enough to get within range of the far weaker transmitter in the drop capsule. Homing on this signal was so simple, a human pilot could have done it himself. The shining sphere loomed up, then vanished out of sight of the viewports as the ship rotated to bring the space lock into line. Magnetic clamps cut in when they made contact. "Go down and let the bug doctor in," Ijhel said. "I'll stay and monitor the board in case of trouble." "What do I have to do?" "Get into a suit and open the outer lock. Most of the drop sphere is made of inflatable metallic foil, so don't bother to look for the entrance. Just cut a hole in it with the oversized opener you'll find in the toolbox. After Dr. Moores gets aboard, jettison the thing. Only get the radio and locator unit out first. It gets used again." The tool did look like a giant opener. Brion carefully felt the resilient metal skin that covered the lock entrance until he was sure there was nothing on the other side. Then he jabbed the point through and cut a ragged hole in the thin foil. Dr. Moores boiled out of the sphere, knocking Brion aside. "What's the matter?" Brion asked. There was no radio on the other suit. He couldn't answer, but he did shake his fist angrily. The helmet ports were opaque, so there was no way to tell what expression went with the gesture. Brion shrugged and turned back to salvaging the equipment pack, pushing the punctured balloon free and sealing the lock. When pressure was pumped back to ship normal, he cracked his helmet and motioned the other to do the same. "You're a pack of dirty, lying dogs," Dr. Moores said when the helmet came off. Brion was completely baffled. Dr. Lee Moores had long, dark hair, large eyes, and a delicately shaped mouth now taut with anger. "Dr. Moores, as a woman, are you the filthy swine responsible for this atrocity?" Lee asked menacingly. "In the control room," Brion said quickly, knowing when cowardice was much preferable to valor. "A man named Ihjel. There's a lot of him to hate. You can have a good time doing it. I just joined up myself." He was talking to her back as she stormed from the room. Brion hurried after her, not wanting to miss the first human spark of int. "Rest in the trip to date. Kidnapped, lied to, and forced against my will. There is no court in the galaxy that won't give you the maximum sentence, and I'll scream with pleasure as they roll your fat body into solitary." "They shouldn't have sent a woman," Ijhel said, completely ignoring her words. "I asked for a highly qualified exobiologist for a difficult assignment. Someone young and tough enough to do field work under severe condition. So the recruiting office sends me the smallest female they can find, one who'll melt in the first rain." "I will not," Lee shouted. "Female resiliency is a well-known fact, and I'm in far better condition than the average woman, which has nothing to do with what I'm telling you. I was hired for a job in the university on Mahler's World and signed a contract to that effect. Then this bully of an agent tells me the contract has been changed. Read sub-paragraph 189C or some such nonsense, and I'll be transshipping. He stuffed me into that suffocation basketball without a by your leave, and they threw me overboard. If that is not a violation of personal privacy—" "Cut a new course, Brion," Ijhel broke in. "Find the nearest settled planet and head us there. We have to drop this woman and find a man for this job. We are going to what is undoubtedly the most interesting planet an exobiologist ever conceived of, but we need a man who can take orders and not faint when it gets too hot." Brion was lost. Ijhel had done all the navigating, and Brion had no idea how to begin a search like this. "Oh no, you don't," Lee said. "You don't get rid of me that easily. I placed first in my class, and most of the 500 other students were. Ihjel, this is only a man's universe because the men say so. What is the name of this garden planet where we are going? Dis. I'll give you a briefing as soon as I get this ship on course." He turned to the controls, and Lee slipped out of her suit and went into the lavatory to comb her hair. Brion closed his mouth, aware suddenly it had been open for a long time. "Is that what you call applied psychology?" he asked. "Not really. She was going to go along with the job in the end, since she did sign the contract even if she didn't read the fine print, but not until she had exhausted her feelings. I just shortened the process by switching her onto the male superiority hate. Most women who succeed in normally masculine fields have a reflexive antipathy there. They have been hit on the head with it so much." He fed the course tape into the console and scowled. "But there was a good chunk of truth in what I said. I wanted a young, fit, and highly qualified biologist from recruiting. I never thought they would find a female one, and it's too late to send her back now. This is no place for a woman." "Why?" Brion asked as Lee appeared in the doorway. Come inside and I'll show you both, Ijhel said. Dis, Ijhel said, consulting a thick file. Third planet out from its primary. Epsilon Eridani. The fourth planet is Nijord. Remember that because it is going to be very important. Dis is a place you need a good reason to visit and no reason at all to leave. Too hot, too dry. The temperature in the temperate zones rarely drops below 100 Fahrenheit. The planet is nothing but scorched rock and burning sand. Most of the water is underground and normally inaccessible. The surface water is all in the form of briny, chemically saturated swamps, undrinkable without extensive processing. All the facts and figures are here in the folders and you can study them later. Right now, I want you just to get the idea that this planet is as loathsome and inhospitable as they come. So are the people. This is a solido of a Disan. Lee gasped at the three-dimensional representation on the screen, not at the physical aspects of the man as the Geologist trained in the specialty of alien life. She had seen a lot stranger sights. It was the man's pose, the expression on his face. Tense to leap, his lips drawn back to show all of his teeth. He looks like he wanted to kill the photographer, she said. He almost did, just after the picture was taken. Like all Disans, he has an overwhelming hatred and loathing of offworlders. Not without good reason, though. His planet was idled completely by chance during the breakdown. I'm not sure of the details, but the overall picture is clear, since the story of their desertion forms the basis of all the myths and animistic religions on Dis. Apparently, there were large-scale mining operations carried on there once. The world is rich enough in minerals, and mining it is very simple. But water came only from expensive extraction processes, and I imagine most of the food came from offworld, which was good enough until the settlement was forgotten, the way a lot of other planets were during the breakdown. All the records were destroyed in the fighting, and the ore carriers pressed into military service. Dis was on its own. What happened to the people there is a tribute to the adaptation possibilities of Homo sapiens. Individuals died, usually in enormous pain, but the race lived. Changed. A good deal, but still human. As the water and food ran out and the extraction machinery broke down, they must have made heroic efforts to survive. They didn't do it mechanically, but by the time the last machine collapsed, enough people were adjusted to the environment to keep the race going. Third, there, N, of Transk. Descendants are still there, completely adapted to the environment. Their body temperatures are around 130 degrees. They have specialized tissue in the gluteal area for storing water. These are minor changes compared to the major ones they have done in fitting themselves for this planet. I'm not sure of the exact details, but the reports are very enthusiastic about symbiotic relationships. They assure us that this is the first time Homo sapiens has been an active part of either commensalism or inquilinism other than in the role of host. Wonderful, Lee enthused. Is it? Ihjel scowled. Perhaps from the abstract scientific point of view, if you can keep notes, perhaps you might write a book about it sometime, but I'm not interested. I'm sure all these morphological changes and disgusting intimacies will fascinate you, Dr. Moores. But while you are counting blood types and admiring your thermometers, I hope you will be able to devote a little time to a study of the Disans' obnoxious personalities. We must either find out what makes these people tick, or we are going to have to stand by and watch the whole lot blown up. Going to do what? Lee gasped. Destroy them? Wipe out this fascinating genetic pool? Why? Because they are so incredibly loathsome, that's why, Ihjel said. These aboriginal hotheads have managed to lay their hands on some primitive cobalt bombs. They want to light the fuse and drop these bombs on Nijord, the next planet. Nothing said or done can convince them differently. They demand unconditional surrender or else. This is impossible for a lot of reasons, most important because the Nijorders would like to keep their planet for their very own. They have tried every kind of compromise, but none of them work. The Disans are out to commit racial suicide. A Nijord flaw. It is now over Dis, and the deadline has almost expired for the surrender of the cobalt bombs. The Nijord ships carry enough H-bombs to turn the entire planet into an atomic pile. That is what we must stop. Brion looked at the solido on the screen, trying to make some judgment of the man. Bare, horny feet, A bulky, ragged length of cloth around the waist was the only garment. What looked like a piece of green vine was hooked over one shoulder. From a plated belt were suspended a number of odd devices made of hand-beaten metal, drilled stone, and looped leather. The only recognizable one was a thin knife of unusual design. Loops of piping, flared bells, carved stones tied in senseless patterns of thonging gave the rest of the collection a bizarre appearance. Perhaps they had some religious significance, but the well-worn and handled look of most of them gave Brion an uneasy sensation. If they were used, what in the universe could they be used for? I can't believe it, he finally concluded. Except for the exotic hardware, this lowbrow looks like he has sunk back into the Stone Age. I don't see how his kind can be of any real threat to another planet. The Nijorders believe it, and that's good enough for me, Ijhel said. They are paying our Cultural Relationships Foundation a good sum to try and prevent this war. Since they are our employers, we must do what they ask. Brion ignored this large lie since it was obviously designed as an explanation for Lee, but he made a mental note to query Ihjel later about the real situation. Here are the tech reports. Ihjel dropped them on the table. Dis has some spacers as well as the cobalt bombs, though these are the real threat. A tramp tray. It was picked up leaving Dis. It had delivered a jump space launcher that can drop those bombs on Nijord while anchored to the bedrock of Dis. While essentially a peaceful and happy people, the Nijorders were justifiably annoyed at this and convinced the tramp's captain to give them some more information. It's all here. Boiled down, it gives a minimum deadline by which time the launcher can be set up and start throwing bombs. When is that? Deadline? Lee asked. In 10 days. If the situation hasn't been changed drastically by then, the Nijorders are going to wipe all life from the face of Dis. I assure you they don't want to do it, but they will drop the bombs in order to assure their own survival. What am I supposed to do? Lee asked, annoyedly flipping the pages of the report. I don't know a thing about nucleonics or jump space. I'm an exobiologist. With a supplementary degree in anthropology. What help could I possibly be? Ihjel looked down at her, fondling his jaw, fingers sunk deep into the rolls of flesh. My faith in our recruiters is restored, he said. That's a combination that is probably rare even on Earth. You're as scrawny as an underfed chicken, but young enough to survive if we keep a close eye on you. He cut off Lee's angry protest with a raised hand. No. More bickering. There isn't time. The Nijorders must have lost over 30 agents trying to find the bombs. Our foundation has had 6 people killed, including my late predecessor in charge of the project. He was a good man, but I think he went at this problem the wrong way. I think it is a cultural one, not a physical one. Run it through again with the power turned up, Lee said, frowning. All I hear is static. It's the old problem of Genesis. Like Newton and the falling apple, Levy and the hysteresis in the warp field. Everything has a beginning. If we can find out why these people are so hell-bent on suicide, we might be able to change the reasons. Not that I intend to stop looking for the bombs or the jump space generator either. We are going to try anything that will avert this planetary murder. You're a lot brighter than you look, Lise. Ed, rising and carefully stacking the sheets of the report. You can count on me for complete cooperation. Now I'll study all this in bed if one of you overweight gentlemen will show me to a room with a strong lock on the inside of the door. Don't call me. I'll call you when I want breakfast. Brion wasn't sure how much of her barbed speech was humor and how much serious, so he said nothing. He showed her to an empty cabin. She did lock the door, then looked for Ihjel. The winner was in the galley adding to his girth with an immense gelatin dessert that filled a good-sized tureen. Is she short for a native Terran? Brion asked. The top of her head is below my chin. That's the norm. Earth is a reservoir of tired genes, weak backs, vermiform appendixes, bad eyes. If they didn't have the universities and the trained people we need, I would never use them. Why did you lie to her about the Foundation? Because it's a secret. Isn't that reason enough? Ihjel rumbled angrily, scraping the last dregs from the bowl. Better eat something. Build up the strength. The Foundation has to maintain its undercover status if it is going to accomplish anything. If she returns to Earth after this, it's better that she should know nothing of our real work. If she joins up, there'll be time enough to tell her. But I doubt if she will like the way we operate, particularly since I plan to drop some H-bombs on Dis myself if we can't turn off the war. I don't believe it. You heard me correctly. Don't bulge your eyes and look moronic. As a last resort, I'll drop the bombs myself rather than let the Nijerders do it. That might save them. Save them? They'd all be radiated and dead. Brion's voice was raised in anger. Not the dis. Ens, I want to save the Nijerders. Stop clenching your fists and sit down and have some of this cake. It's delicious. The Nijerders are all that counts here. They have a planet blessed by the laws of chance. When Dis was cut off from outside contact, the survivors turned into a gang of swamp-crawling homicidals. It did the opposite for Nijord. You can survive there just by pulling fruit off a tree. The population was small, educated, intelligent. Instead of sinking into an eternal siesta, they matured into a vitally different society. Not mechanical. They weren't even using the wheel when they were rediscovered. They became sort of cultural specialists, digging deep into the philosophical aspects of interrelationship. The thing that machine societies never have had time for. Of course, this was ready-made for the Cultural Relationships Foundation, and we have been working with them ever since, not guiding so much as protecting them from any blows that might destroy this growing idea. But we've fallen down on the job. Nonviolence is essential to those people. They have vitality without needing destruction. But if they are forced to blow up Dis for their own survival, against every one of their basic tenets, their philosophy won't endure. Physically, they'll live on. As just one more dog-eat-dog. Land it with an A-bomb for any of the competition who drop behind. Sounds like paradise now. Don't be smug. It's just another world full of people with the same old likes, dislikes, and hatreds. But they are evolving a way of living together without violence that may someday form the key to mankind's survival. They are worth looking after. Now get below and study your Desan and read the reports. Get it all pat before. Land. Identify yourself, please. The quiet words from the speaker in no way appeared to coincide with the picture on the screen. The spacer that had matched their orbit over Dis had recently been a freighter. A quick conversion had tacked the hulking shape of a primary weapons turret on top of her hull, the black disk of the immense muzzle pointing squarely at them. Ijhel switched open the ship-to-ship communication channel. This is Ijhel. Retinal pattern 490BJ 4-67, which is also the code that is supposed to get me through your blockade. Do you want to check that pattern? There will be no need, thank you. If you will turn on your recorder, I have a message relayed to you from Prime 4. Recording and out, Ijhel said. Damn, trouble already and 4 days to blow up. Prime 4 is our headquarters on Dis. This ship carries of her cargo so we can land at the spaceport. This is probably a change of plan and I don't like the smell of it. There was something behind Ijhel's grumbling this time, and without conscious effort, Brion could sense the chilling touch of the other man's angst. Trouble was waiting for them on the planet below. When the message was typed by the decoder, Ihjel hovered over it, reading each word as it appeared on the paper. He only snorted when he was finished and went below to the galley. Brion pulled the message out of the machine and read it. Ihjel, spaceport, landing danger night, landing preferable coordinates, map 46J92MN 75. Remote, your ship Vion will meet end, dropping into the darkness was safe enough. It was done on instruments, and the Desans were thought to have no detection apparatus. The altimeter dia was spun backwards to 0, and a soft vibration was the only indication they had landed. All of the cabin lights were off except for the fluorescent glow of the instruments. A white speckled gray filled the infrared screen, radiation from the still warm sand and stone. There were no moving blips on it, nor the characteristic shape of a shielded atomic generator. We're here first, Ihjel said, opaquing the ports and turning on the cabby. Lights, they blinked at each other, faces damp with perspiration. Must you have the ship this hot? Lee asked, patting her forehead with an already sodden kerchief. Stripped of her heavier clothing, she looked even tinier to Brion. But the thin cloth tunic, reaching barely halfway to her knees, concealed very little. Small she may have appeared to him, unfeminine she was not. In fact, she was quite attractive. Shall I turn around so you can Are at the back, too? She asked Brion. 5 days' experience had taught him that this type of remark was best ignored. It only became worse if he tried to answer. This is hotter than this cabin, he said, changing the subject. By raising the interior temperature, we can at least prevent any sudden shock when we go out. I know the theory, but it doesn't stop me from sweating, she snapped. Best thing you can do is sweat, Ijhel said. He looked like a glistening captive balloon in shorts. Finishing a bottle of beer, he took another from the freezer. Have a beer. No, thank you. I'm afraid it would dissolve the last shreds of tissue and my kidneys would float completely away. On Earth we never. Get Professor Moore's luggage for her, Ijhel said. Vion's coming, there's his signal. I'm sending this ship up before any of the locals spot it. When he cracked the outer port, the puff of air struck them like the exhaust from a furnace, dry and hot as a tongue of flame. Brion heard Lee's gasp in the darkness. She stumbled down the ramp and he followed her slowly, careful of the weight of packs and equipment he carried. The sand burned through his boots, still hot from the day. Ihjel came last, the remote control unit in his hand. As soon as they were clear, he activated it and the ramp slipped back like a giant. Tongue. As soon as the lock had swung shut, the ship lifted and drifted upwards silently towards its orbit, a shrinking darkness against the stars. There was just enough starlight to see the sandy wastes around them, as wave-filled as a petrified sea. The dark shape of a sandcar drew up over a dune and hummed to a stop. When the door opened, Ihjel stepped towards it, and everything happened at once. Ihjel broke into a blue nimbus of crackling flame, his skin blackening, charred, dead in an instant. A second pillar of flame bloomed next to the car and a choking scream, cut off even as it began. Ihjel died silently. Brion was diving even as the electrical discharges still crackled in the air. The boxes and packs dropped from him and he slammed against Lee, knocking her to the ground. He hoped she had the sense to stay there and be quiet. This was his own. He conscious thought, the rest was reflex. Rolling over and over as fast as he could, the spitting electrical flames flared again, playing over the bundles of luggage he had dropped. This time Brion was expecting it, pressed flat to the ground a short distance away. He was facing the darkness away from the sandcar and saw the brief, blue glow of the ion rifle discharge. His own gun was in his hand. When Ihjel had given him the missile weapon, he had asked no questions, just strapped it on. There had been no thought that he would need it this quickly. Holding it firmly before him in both hands, he let his body aim at the spot where the glow had been. A whiplash of explosive slugs ripped the night air. They found their target, and something thrashed voicelessly and died. In the brief instant after he fired, a jarring weight landed on his back, and a line of fire circled his throat. Normally he fought with a calm mind, with no thoughts other than the contest. But Ihjel, a friend, a man of Anvhar, had died a few seconds earlier, and Brion found himself welcoming this physical violence and pain. There are many foolish and dangerous things that can be done, such as smoking next to high-octane fuel and putting fingers into electrical sockets. Just as dangerous and equally deadly is physically attacking a inner of the 20s. Two men hit Brion together, though this made very little difference. The first died suddenly as hands like steel claws found his neck, and in a single spasmodic contraction did such damage to the large blood vessels there that they burst and tiny hemorrhages filled his brain. The second man had time for a single scream, though he died just as swiftly when those hands closed on his larynx. Running in a crouch, partially on his knuckles, Brion swiftly made a circle of the area, gun ready. There were no others. Only when he touched the softness of Lee's body did the blood anger seep from him. He was suddenly aware of the pain and fatigue, the sweat soaking his body and the breath rasping in his throat. Holstering the gun, he ran light fingers over her skull, finding a bruised spot on one temple. Her chest was rising and falling regularly. She had struck her head when he pushed her. It had undoubtedly saved her life. Sitting down suddenly, he let his body relax, breathing deeply. Everything was a little better now, except for the pain at his throat. His fingers found a thin strand on the side of his neck with a knobby weight on the end. There was another weight on his other shoulder and a thin line of pain across his neck. When he pulled on them, both the strangler's cord came away in his hand. It was in fiber, strong as a wire. When it had been pulled around his neck, it had sliced the surface skin and flesh like a knife, halted only by the corded bands of muscle below. Brion threw it from him, into the darkness where it had come from. He could think again, and he carefully kept his thoughts from the men he had killed. Knowing it was useless, he went to Ihjel's body. A single touch of the scorched flesh was enough. Behind him, Lee moaned, returning consciousness, and he hurried on to the sandcar, stepping over the charred body outside the door. The driver was slumped, dead, killed perhaps by the same strangling cord that had sunk into Brion's throat. He laid the man gently on the sand and closed the lids over the staring horror of the eyes. There was a canteen in the car, and he brought it back to Lee. "My head. I've hurt my head," Lee said groggily. "Just a bruise," he reassured her. "Drink some of this water and you'll soon feel better. Lie back. Everything's over for the moment and you can rest." "Ijhel's dead," she said with sudden shocked memory. "They've killed him. What's happened?" She tensed, tried to rise, and he pressed her back gently. "I'll tell you everything. Just don't try to get up yet. There was an ambush and they killed Vion and the driver of the sandcar as well as Ihjel. 3 men did it and they all dead now too. I don't think there are any more around, but if there are, I'll hear them coming. We're just going to wait a few minutes until you feel better, then we're getting out of here in the car. Bring the ship down." There was a thin edge of hysteria in her voice. "We can't stay here alone. We don't know where to go or what to do. With Ihjel dead, the whole thing's spoiled. We have to get out. There are some things that can't sound gentle, no matter how gently they are said. This was one of them. "I'm sorry, Lee, but the ship is out of our reach right now. Ihjel was killed with an ion gun, and it fused the control unit into a solid lump. We must take the car and get to the city. We'll do it now. See if you can stand up. I'll help you." She rose, not saying anything, and as they walked towards the car, a single reddish moon cleared the hills behind them. In its light, Brion saw a dark line bisecting the rear panel of the sandcar. He stopped abruptly. "What's the matter?" Lee asked. The unlocked engine cover could have only one significance, and he pushed it open knowing in advance what he would see. The attackers had been very thorough and fast. In the short time available to them, they had killed the driver and the car as well. Ruddy light shone on torn wires, ripped out connections. Repair would be impossible. "I think we'll have to walk," he told her, trying to keep the gloom out of his voice. "This spot is roughly 150 meters from the city of Hovstad where we have to go. We should be able to. We're going to die. We can't walk anywhere. This whole planet is a death trap. Let's get back in the ship." There was a thin shrillness of hysteria at the edge of her voice, as well as a subtle slurring of the sounds. Brion didn't try to reason with her or bother to explain. She had a concussion from the blow, that much was obvious. He made her sit and rest while he made what preparations he could for the long walk. Clothing first. With each passing minute, the desert air was growing colder as the day's heat ebbed away. Lee was beginning to shiver, and he took some heavier clothing from her charred bag and made her pull it on over her light tunic. There was little else that was, earth-carrying. The canteen from the car and a first-aid kit he found in one of the compartments. There were no maps or radio. Navigation was obviously done by compass on this almost featureless desert. The car was equipped with an electrically operated gyro compass of no possible use to him. He did use it to check the direction to Hovstad, as he remembered it from the map, and found it lined up perfectly with the tracks the car had cut into the sand. It had come directly from the city. They could find their way by backtracking. Time was slipping away. He would like to have buried Ihjel and the men from the car, but the night hours were too valuable to be wasted. The best he could do was put the 3 corpses in the car for protection from the Desan animals. Locking the door, he threw the key as far as he could in the blackness. Lee had slipped into a restless sleep, and he carefully shook her awake. "Come," Brion said, "we have a little walking to do." With the cool air and firmly packed sand underfoot, walking should have been easy. Lee spoiled that. The concussion seemed to have temporarily cut off the reasoning part of her brain, leaving a direct connection to her vocal cords. As she stumbled along, only half-conscious, she mumbled all of her darkest fears that were better left unvoiced. Occasionally there was relevancy in her complaints. They would lose their way, never find the city, die of thirst, freezing, heat, or hunger. Interspersed and entwined with these were fears from her past that still floated, submerged in the timeless ocean of her subconscious. Some Brion could understand, though he tried not to listen. Fears of losing credits, not getting the highest grade, falling behind, a woman alone in a world of men, leaving school being lost. Trampled among the nameless hordes that struggled for survival in the crowded city-states of Earth. There were other things she was afraid of that made no sense to a man of Anvar. Who were the Alkians that seemed to trouble her? Or what was Cancery? Dadel, and Hadel. Who was Mancy and whose name kept coming up over and over, each time accompanied by a little moan? Brion stopped and picked her up in both arms. With a sigh, she settled against the hard width of his chest and was instantly asleep. Even with the additional weight, he made better time now, and he stretched to his fastest, kilometer-consuming stride to make good use of these best hours. Somewhere on a stretch of gravel and shelving rock, he lost the track of the sandcar. He wasted no time looking for it. By carefully watching the glistening stars rise, and said he had made a good estimate of the geographic Orth. Dis didn't seem to have a pole star, however a box-like constellation turned slowly around the invisible point of the pole. Keeping this positioned in line with his right shoulder guided him on the westerly course he needed. When his arms began to grow tired, he lowered Lee gently to the ground. She didn't wake. Stretching for an instant, before taking up his burden again, Brion was struck by the terrible loneliness of the desert. His breath made a vanishing mist against the stars, all else was darkness and silence. How distant he was from his home, his people, his planet. Even the constellations of the night sky were different. He was used to solitude, but this was a loneliness that touched some deep-buried instinct. A shiver that wasn't from the desert cold touched lightly along his spine, prickling at the hairs on his neck. It was time to go on. He shrugged the disquieting sensations off and carefully tied Lee into the jacket he had been wearing. Slung like a pack on his back, it made walking easier. The gravel gave way to sliding dunes of sand that seemed to continue to infinity. A painful, slipping climb to the top of each one, then an equally difficult descent to the black-pooled hollow at the foot of the next. With the first lightening of the sky in the east, he stopped, breath rasping in his chest. A mark his direction before the stars faded. One line scratched in the sand pointed due north, a second pointed out the course they should follow. When they were aligned to his satisfaction, he washed his mouth out with a single swallow of water and sat on the sand next to the still form of the girl. Gold fingers of fire searched across the sky, wiping out the stars. It was magnificent. Brion forgot his fatigue in appreciation. There should be some way of preserving it. A quatrain would be best, short enough to be remembered, yet requiring attention and skill to compact everything into it. He had scored high with his quatrains in the 20s. This would be a special one. Tained, his poetry mentor, would have to get a copy. "What are you mumbling about?" Lee asked, looking up at the craggy blackness of his profile against the reddening sky. "Poem," he said. "Sh. Just a minute." It was too much for Lee, coming after the tension and dangers of the night. She began to laugh, laughing even harder when he scowled at her angrily. Only when she heard the tinge of growing hysteria did she make an attempt to break off the laughter. The sun cleared the horizon, washing a sudden warmth over them. Lee gasped. "Your throat's been cut. You're bleeding to death?" "Not really," he said, touching his fingertips lightly again. It's the blood-clotted wound that circled his neck. Just superficial. Depression sat on him as he suddenly remembered the battle and death of the previous night. Lee didn't notice his face. She was busy digging in the pack he had thrown down. He had to use his fingers to massage and force away the grimace of pain that twisted his mouth. Memory was more painful than the wound. How easily he had killed. 3 men, how close to the surface of the civilized man the animal dwelled. In the countless matches he had used those holds, always drawing back from the exertion of the full killing power. They were part of a game, part of the 20s. Yet when his friend had been killed, he had become a killer himself. He believed in nonviolence and the sanctity of life, until the first test when he had killed without hesitation. More ironic was the fact he really felt no guilt. Shock at the che. "Yes, but no more than that. Lift your chin," Lee said, brandishing the antiseptic applier she had found in the medicine kit. He lifted obligingly, and the liquid drew a cool, burning line across his neck. Antibiopills would do a lot more good, since the wound was completely clotted by now, but he didn't speak his thoughts aloud. For the moment, Lee had forgotten herself in taking care of him. He put some of the antiseptic on her scalp bruise, and she squeaked, pulling back. They both swallowed the pills. "That sun is hot already," Lee grumbled, peeling off her heavy clothing. "Let's find a nice, cool cave to crawl into for the day." "I don't think there are any here, just sand. We have to walk." "I know we have to walk," she interrupted angrily. "There's no need for a lecture about it. You're as seriously cubical as the Bank of Terra. Relax, take 10 and start again." Lee was making empty talk while she listened to the memory of hysteria tittering at the fringes of her brain. No time for that. We have to keep going. Brion climbed slowly to his feet after stowing everything in the pack. When he sighted along his marker at the western horizon, he saw nothing to mark their course, only the marching dunes. He helped Lee to her feet and began walking slowly towards them. Just ho. Hold on a second, Lee called after him. Where do you think you're going? In that direction, he said, pointing. I hoped there would be some landmarks. There aren't. We'll have to keep on by dead reckoning. The sun will keep us pretty well on course. If we aren't there by night, the stars will be a better guide. All this on an empty stomach. How about breakfast? I'm hungry and thirsty. No food. He shook the canteen that gurgled emptily. It has been only partly filled when he found it. The water's low and we'll need it later. I need it now, she snapped. My mouth tastes like an unemptied ashtray and I'm dry as paper. Just a single swallow, he said. This is all we have. Lee sipped at it with her eyes closed in appreciation. He sealed the top and returned it to the pack without taking any himself. They were sweating as they started up the first dune. The desert was barren of life. They were the only things moving under that merciless sun. Their shadows pointed the way ahead of them, and as the shadows shortened, the heat rose. It had an intensity Lee had never experienced before, a physical weight that pushed at her with a searing hand. Her clothing was sodden with perspiration, and it trickled burning into her eyes. The light and heat made it hard to see, and she leaned on the immovable strength of Brion's arm. He walked on steadily, apparently ignoring the heat and discomfort. I wonder if those things are edible or store water. Brion's voice was a harsh rasp. Lee blinked and squinted at the leathery shape on the summit of the dune. Plant or animal, it was hard to tell. The size of a man's head, wrinkled and gray as dried-out leather, knobbed with thick spikes. Brion pushed it up with his toe, and they had a brief glimpse of a white roundness, like a shaft. Any taproot going down into the dune. Then the thing contracted, pulling itself lower into the sand. At the same instant, something thin and sharp lashed out through a fold in the skin, striking at Brion's boot and withdrawing. There was a scratch on the hard plastic, beaded with drops of green liquid. Probably poison, he said, digging his toe into the sand. This thing is too mean to fool with without a good reason. Let's keep going. It was before noon when Lee fell down. She really wanted to go on, but her body wouldn't obey. The thin soles of her shoes were no protection against the burning sand, and her feet were lumps of raw pain. Heat hammered down, poured up from the sand, and swirled her in an oven of pain. The air she gasped in was molten metal that dried and cracked her mouth. Each pulse of her heart throbbed blood to the wound in her scalp until it seamed her. Skull would burst with the agony. She had stripped down to the short tunic, in spite of Brion's insistence that she keep her body protected from the sun, and that clung to her, soaked with sweat. She tore at it in a desperate effort to breathe. There was no escape from the unending heat, though the baked sand burned torture into her knees and hands she couldn't rise. It took all her strength not to fall farther. Her eyes closed and everything swirled. In immense circles, Brion, blinking through slitted eyes, saw her go down. He lifted and carried her again as he had the night before. The hot touch of her body shocked his bare arms. Her skin was flushed pink. Wiping his palm free of sweat and sand, he touched her skin and felt the ominous hot dryness, heat-shock, all the symptoms. Dry, flushed skin, the ragged breathing. Her temperature rising quickly as her body stopped fighting the heat. It and succumbed. There was nothing he could do here to protect her from the heat. He measured a tiny portion of the remaining water into her mouth, and she swallowed convulsively. The thinnest of the clothing protected her slight body from the direct rays of the sun. After that, he could only take her in his arms and keep on toward the horizon. An outcropping of rock there threw a tiny patch of shade, and he walked toward it. The ground here, shielded from the direct rays of the sun, felt almost cool by contrast. Lee opened her eyes when he put her down, peering up at him through a haze of pain. She wanted to apologize to him for her weakness, but no words came from the dried membrane of her throat. His body above her seemed to swim back and forth in the heat waves, swaying like a tree in a high wind. Shock drove her eyes open, cleared her mind for the instant. Lee was swaying. With sudden horror she realized how much she had come to depend on the eternal solidity of his strength. Now it was failing. All over his body, the corded muscles contracted in ridges, striving to keep him erect. She saw his mouth pulled open by the taut cords of his neck, and the gaping, silent scream was more terrible than any sound. Then she screamed herself as his eyes rolled back, leaving just the empty white the eyeballs staring terribly at her. He went over back down like a felled tree, thudding heavily on the sand. Unconscious or dead, she couldn't tell. She pulled limply at his leg, but couldn't drag his immense weight into the shade. Brion lay on his back in the sun, sweating. Lee saw this and knew that he was still alive. Yet what was happening? She groped for memory in the red haze of her mind, but could remember nothing from her medical studies. That would explain this. On every square inch of his body, the sweat glands seethed with sudden activity. From every pore oozed great globules of oily liquid, far thicker than normal perspiration. Brion's arms rippled with motion, and Lee stared, horrified as the hairs there writhed and stirred as though endowed with separate life. His chest rose and fell rapidly, deep, gasping breaths racking his body. Lee could only stare through the dim redness, unreality, and wonder if she was going mad before she died. A coughing fit broke the rhythm of his rasping breath, and when it was over, his breathing was easier. The perspiration still covered his body, the individual beads touching and forming tiny streams that seeped down his body and vanished in the sand. He stirred and rolled onto his side, facing her, his eyes open and normal now as he smiled. "Didn't mean to frighten you. It caught me suddenly, coming at the wrong season and everything. It was a bit of a jar to my system. I'll get you some water now, there's still a bit left." "What happened? When you looked like that when you fell?" "Take 2 swallows, no more," he said, holding the canteen to her mouth. "Just summer change, that's all. Happens to us every year on Anvhar, only not that violently, of course. In the winter our bodies store a layer of fat under the skin for insulation, and sweating almost ceases completely. Lot of internal changes, too. When the weather warms up, the process is reversed. The fat is metabolized and the sweat glands enlarge and begin working overtime as the body prepares for 2 months of hard work, heat, and little sleep. I guess the heat here triggered off the summer change early." "You mean you've adapted to this terrible planet?" "Just about. Though it does feel a little warm. I'll need a lot more water soon, so we can't remain here. Do you think you can stand the sun if I carry you?" "No, but I won't feel any better staying here." She was lightheaded, scarcely aware of what she said. "Keep going, I guess, keep going." As soon as she was out of the shadow of the rock, the sunlight burst over her again in a wave of hot pain. She was unconscious at once. Her slight weight was no burden to Brion, and he made his best speed, heading toward the spot on the horizon where the sun would set. Without water, he knew he could not last more than a day or 2 at best. When sunset came, he was still walking steadily. Only when the air chilled did he stop to dress them both in the warm clothes and push on. Lee regained consciousness in the cool night air and finished the last mouthfuls of water. She wanted to walk, but could only moan with pain when her burned feet touched the ground. He put ointment on them and wrapped them in cloth. They were too swollen to go back into the ragged shoes. Lifting his burden, he walked on into the night, following the guiding stars. Except for the nagging thirst, it was an easy night. He wouldn't need sleep for 2 or 3 days more, so that didn't bother him. His muscles had a plentiful supply of fuel at hand in the no-la. Nger wanted subcutaneous fatty layer. Metabolizing it kept him warm. By running at a ground-eating pace whenever the footing was smooth, he made good time. By dawn, he was feeling a little tired and was at least 10 kilos lighter due to the loss of the burned-up fat. There was no sight of the city yet. This was the last day. Massive as the adaptation of his body was to the climate, it still needed water to function. As his pores opened, in the heat he knew the end was very close. Weaving, stumbling, trying not to fall with the unconscious girl, he climbed dune after unending dune. Before his tortured eyes, the sun expanded and throbbed like a gigantic beating heart. He struggled to the top of the mountain of sand and looked at the Desan standing a few feet away. They were both too surprised by the sudden encounter to react at once. For a breath of time, they stared at each other, unmoving. When they reacted, it was with the same defense of fear. Brion dropped the girl, bringing the gun up from the holster in the return of the same motion. The Desan jerked a belled tube from his waistband and raised it to his mouth. Brion didn't fire. A dead man had taught him how to train his empathetic sense, and to trust it. In spite of the fear that wanted him to jerk the trigger, a different sense read the unvoiced emotions of the native Desan. There was fear there and hatred. Welling up around these was a strong desire not to commit violence this time, to communicate instead. Brion felt and recognized all this in a small part of a second. He had to act instantly to avoid a tragic accident. A jerk of his wrist threw the gun to one side. As soon as it was gone, he regretted his loss. He was gambling their lives on an ability he still was not sure of. The Desan had the tube to his mouth when the gun hit the ground. He held the pose, unmoving, thinking. Then he accepted Brion's action and thrust the tube back into his waistband. "You have any water?" Brion asked, the guttural Desan words hurting his throat. "I have water," the man said. He still didn't move. "Who are you?" "We're from off-planet. We had an accident. We want to go to the city." "The water." The Desan looked at the unconscious girl and made his decision. Over one shoulder he wore one of the green objects that Brion remembered from the Solido. He pulled it off, and the thing writhed slowly in his hands. It was alive. A green length a meter long, like a noduled section of a thick vine. One end flared out into a petal-like formation. The Desan took a hook-shaped object from his waist and thrust it into the petaled orifice. When he turned the hook in a quick motion, the length of green writhed and curled around his arm. He pulled something small and dark out and threw it to the ground, extending the twisting green shape towards Brion. "Put your mouth to the end and drink," he said. Lee needed the water more, but he drank first, suspicious of the living water source. A hollow below the writhing petals was filling with straw-colored water from the fibrous, reedy interior. He raised it to his mouth and drank. The water was hot and tasted swampy. Sudden sharp pains around his mouth made him jerk the thing away. Tiny, glistening white barbs projected from the petals, pink-tipped now with his blood. Brion swung towards the Desan angrily and stopped when he looked at the other man's face. His mouth was surrounded by many small scars. "The Vede does not like to give up its water, but it always does," the man said. Brion drank again, then put the Vede to Lee's mouth. She moaned without regaining consciousness, her lips seeking reflexively for the life-saving liquid. When she was satisfied, Brion gently drew the barbs from her flesh and drank again. The Desan hunkered down on his heels and watched them expressionlessly. Brion handed back the Vede, then held some of the clothes so Lee was in their shade. He settled into the same position as the native and looked closely at him. Squatting immobile on his heels, the Desan appeared perfectly comfortable under the flaming sun. There was no trace of perspiration on his naked, brown skin. Long hair fell to his shoulders, and startlingly blue eyes stared back at Brion from deep-set sockets. The heavy kilt around his loins was the only garment he wore. Once more the Vede rested over his shoulder, still stirring unhappily. Around his waist was the same collection of leather, stone, and brass objects that had been in the Solido. Two of them now had meaning to Brion. The tube-and mouthpiece, a blowgun of some kind, and the specially shaped hook for opening the Vede. He wondered if the other strangely formed things had equally realistic functions. If you accepted them as artifacts with a purpose, not barbaric decorations, you had to accept their owner as something more than the crude savage. He resembled. "My name is Brion, and you may not have my name. Why are you here? To kill my people." Brion forced the memory of the last night away. Killing was just what he had done. Some expectancy in the man's manner, some sensed feeling of hope prompted Brion to speak the truth. "I'm here to stop your people from being killed. I believe in the end of the war. Prove it. Take me to the Cultural Relationships Foundation. In the city, and I'll prove it. I can do nothing here in the desert, except die." For the first time there was emotion on the Desan's face. He frowned and muttered something to himself. There was a fine beading of sweat above his eyelids now as he fought an internal battle. Coming to a decision, he rose, and Brion stood too. "Come with me. I'll take you to Hovstad. But wait, there is one thing I must know. Are you from Nijord?" "No, the nameless." Desan merely grunted and turned away. Brion shouldered Lee's unconscious body and followed him. They walked for 2 hours, the Desan setting a cruel pace before they reached a wasteland of jumbled rock. The native pointed to the highest tower of sand-eroded stone. "Wait near this," he said. Someone will come for you. He watched while Brion placed the girl's still body in the shade and passed over the vide for the last time. Just be. Before leaving, he turned back, hesitating. My name is... Ulv, he said. Then he was gone. Brion did what he could to make Lee comfortable, but it was very little. If she didn't get medical attention, soon she would be dead. Dehydration and shock were uniting to destroy her.